Hello ladies and gentlemen, Koldar here. Today we are looking at Heroic Grand Empress Shek'zeer in Heart of Fear, and of course 10-man. So this fight is quite crazy. You probably heard, if you were looking to do Heroic, that this fight is really all about the damage output throughout the encounter. So the healing requirements are pretty severe. And as you listen to this guide and watch the video, keep in mind that the strategy we settled on is actually 3 tanks and 3 healers. And that's pretty rare for 10-man, I believe. It's quite typical for raids to use 4 healers and 2 tanks. But we found the 3 and 3 split to be better. And I'll talk about all that stuff in detail. It's also possible to use 3 healers and 2 tanks. But you need a lot of effective healing for your tanks for phase 2. And again, we'll get into that later. So, let's go ahead and start out with the differences between Heroic and Normal. Now, the first addition to Heroic Grand Empress is Corrupted Dissonance Fields. One time during every pair of Dissonance Field spawns, one of the fields will become corrupted, giving it a new ability called Corruption. Corruption is a Shadow Bolt shot fired at a random raid member that deals 75,000 shadow damage. While a dissonance field is corrupted, it will cast corruption at a rate of 3 bolts per second. So you can see them shooting out there at the bottom of the screen. We'll get into the full details of handling these abilities in the next section. The other addition to Heroic is a new ability called Heart of Fear, which occurs in Phase 3. This ability is cast every 10 to 15 seconds, and it originates from a swirly white energy cloud that hovers in one position near the front of Grand Empress. The Heart of Fear ability will target a random raid member and indicate that target with a beam. After 6 seconds, the beam will expel energy from the energy cloud, hitting the first player the beam comes in contact with for 300,000 shadow damage. A corrupted dissonance field is created at differing intervals depending if it is the first pair of dissonance fields in the phase or the second pair. For pair number 1, the corrupted dissonance field is created 12 seconds after the pair number 1 fields are spawned. For pair number 2, the corrupted field is created 22 seconds after the fields spawn. Just as with normal difficulty, both corrupted and non-corrupted dissonance fields will only disperse when they reach 0 energy, at which time they will explode via the sonic discharge effect, causing 275,000 physical damage to the entire raid and despawning the field. Therefore, the goal during Phase 1 is to lessen the lifespan of each corrupted dissonance field, and therefore reduce the time and reduce the total damage that the raid is taking from the corruption bolts. Just as with the normal difficulty, raid members can purposely stand within a dissonance field and cast abilities to be soaked or absorbed by the field, draining energy at a slightly faster rate. However, the primary method for draining a field's energy remains the use of Cry of Terror. Cry of Terror is cast on a random non-melee raid member during Phase 1, and on Heroic, it deals an extremely high amount of damage, of 72,000 shadow damage every 2 seconds to the entire raid, or effectively 360,000 incoming DPS. Therefore, this damage should be mitigated by forcing the Cry of Terror target to stand within a dissonance field as much as possible, which will absorb the Cry of Terror damage and drain the field energy. The trick or difficulty with Phase 1 is properly mitigating the damage of Cry of Terror by allowing that player to be within a dissonance field as much as possible, while also properly ensuring the corrupted dissonance field is the first field to drain energy and explode, and therefore delaying the non-corrupted field explosion long enough to heal the raid up again between the sonic discharge casts. For dissonance field pair number 1, this can be executed very simply. By the time the Cry of Terror is active and that player is within a dissonance field, there will be only a few seconds remaining before the corrupted dissonance field target is selected. Once the corrupted field is chosen, the Cry of Terror target should immediately move into the corrupted dissonance field, if it is not the field he or she is currently utilizing, and begin forcing that corrupted field to drain energy. If the Cry of Terror target reacts quickly, and all future Cry of Terror players are certain to only step into the corrupted dissonance field, then the corrupted field in pair number 1 will easily be the first to lose all energy and explode, with a few seconds before the second field explodes as well. Now on the other hand, things are trickier for field pair number 2. Since the corrupted dissonance field is not selected until 22 seconds after the dissonance fields have spawned, simply forcing the Cry of Terror player to select one field to utilize until that corrupted field is selected will cause a massive disparity in the energy levels, and eventually leads to both fields exploding simultaneously, or nearly as bad, to the non-corrupted field exploding first, which causes the corruption bolts to continue hitting the raid after the massive explosion from the first sonic discharge. Therefore, to properly handle the timing for field pair number 2, it requires the Cry of Terror players to be vigilant about bouncing back and forth between both dissonance fields in pair number 2 to keep the energy levels roughly equal until the corrupted dissonance field is chosen and the raid can safely utilize only that corrupted field from that point forward for Cry of Terror mitigation. Properly dealing with Cry of Terror is especially important given the massive damage that it can cause while the targeted player is standing outside of a dissonance field. However, as you'll recall from normal difficulty, while a player is within a dissonance field, he or she cannot receive any form of healing, not even heal over times, and therefore will be forced to step out of the dissonance field when health levels reach a low but safe percent, typically 25 to 40%. This of course means that during the moments where a Cry of Terror player is without a dissonance field, the raid will be taking about 360,000 extra DPS from Cry of Terror ticks until the player can step back into a dissonance field. This leads to one very important rule. Healers must have an effective system worked out to quickly heal the current Cry of Terror player back to full or near full health within a few seconds of the player stepping out of a dissonance field. How your raid manages this will depend on your composition, of course, but there are a few tips that can help. Number 1, make good use of instant cast spells. Holy Shock, Word of Glory, Power Word Shield, Penance, Swiftman, Riptide, etc. are all very effective tools to quickly assist a Cry of Terror player that just stepped out of a dissonance field. 2, communicate. Both healers and the Cry of Terror target should be in the habit of vocalizing their actions in relation to the field. If a Cry of Terror player is stepping out of a field and informs the healers of their action, the healers can immediately start casting a spell to land just in time. With 2 or 3 healers performing this action, a Cry of Terror target can be healed from 10% to full in 1 or 2 seconds, and then quickly step back into the field safely. Number 3, assign healing roles. Some players and or classes are better suited at certain roles, and handling Cry of Terror spot healing versus other raid-wide healing during Phase 1 is no different. Allow your healers that excel at single target or spot healing to handle Cry of Terror, while stronger raid healers focus on the other tasks at hand. And finally, number 4 is cooldowns. Cry of Terror, when a corrupted dissonance field is exploding, can be especially dangerous. The Cry of Terror target needs to be high enough health to survive the sonic discharge damage, but simultaneously, the raid can't afford to have the Cry of Terror player step out of the dissonance field only moments before the explosion, which will cause a tick or two of Cry of Terror to hit the rest of the raid. Therefore, the best solution to this problem is the use of cooldowns. Since sonic discharge when a field explodes is physical damage, a Paladin's Hand of Protection on the Cry of Terror target a few seconds before the explosion will completely negate the explosion damage for that player, effectively allowing the player to stay in the dissonance field throughout the explosion and therefore avoiding unnecessary Cry of Terror ticks on the rest of the raid. If Hand of Protection is not an option, of course, other damage reduction cooldowns or absorptions will serve the same basic purpose. The heroic version of Phase 2 is mechanically identical to that of normal difficulty. However, there are a few different strategies that can be utilized to handle Phase 2, which will slightly alter the setup and execution so we'll cover each of those in turn. First, however, let's briefly cover the other Phase 2 mechanics. The first big issue is poison bomb casts from the two Korthic Reavers. On Heroic, each bomb hits for 84,000 nature damage initially on a random target, plus another 15,000 damage every 2 seconds over 10 seconds, for a total damage of 159,000 per bomb. Each Reaver will cast 2 bombs simultaneously every 8 seconds throughout the phase, for a total DPS addition of 79,500. However, like everything else, this damage is also amplified by Band of Valor stacks. So with a 3-3-2 split strategy, which we'll talk about in a moment, this damage is up to 103,350 raid DPS. With a 5-3 split, it's around 127,000, and with a 4-4 split, the extra incoming damage from bombs alone is 151,000. One key factor is that bombs do not target melee players, and instead they prefer to target ranged DPS or healers, so you can plan accordingly. However, since each Reaver can independently target the same random ranged raid member, it's not uncommon for a single player to take a spike of 200,000 damage every 8 seconds from the initial bomb damage alone, so try to keep that entire raid topped off throughout the phase. Another common ability in Phase 2, though much less dangerous, is Dispatch from the Windblades. This spell is cast by a single random Windblade every 15 to 25 seconds throughout the phase, and it can and should be interrupted. Dispatch deals 200,000 physical damage per tick on a random raid member within 30 yards, and does so every 2 seconds for 10 seconds total. Since Dispatch is never cast by 2 Windblades at the same time, and is also never cast by a Windblade that is currently fixating, when directly targeting for a normal interrupt is somewhat difficult because there's a lot of mobs, Dispatch casts are a great time to use AE stuns on Windblade packs to both mitigate damage and easily interrupt the Dispatch cast. Now, the most basic strategy for Phase 2 assumes 2 tanks and is essentially identical to what you might use in normal difficulty. Each tank holds the 3 Windblades and 1 Reaver that spawn from each cubby of the room respectively, while the ranged raid members are positioned safely to gather resin, form crystals, and kite Windblades. This illustration shows a strong setup for this. The gray lines represent the first staircase in front of the Grand Empress's platform, which comes to a head or point in the very center. If a raid marker is placed at the convergence point to either side of that central point, as indicated here by the blue and green markers respectively, then this provides a nice repeatable position for your tanks during Phase 2. Once those 2 markers are placed directly down from the central staircase point, which is technically east due to the orientation of the room, another marker should be placed at max heal range equidistant from both the blue and green tank markers, as indicated here by the purple Crystal 1 marker. You can use a monk statue, a non-aggro totem, druid mushrooms, or similar to either check the distance between the blue and the green marker and see what maximum heal range is without aggroing the boss. I would use 38 yards just to be safe and give you a little bit of extra breathing room. Finally, if you move up or west toward the staircase slightly from purple, approximately 10 or 15 yards, and place your final red marker, as you can see here, which I'm standing on right there, then you do not want to place this purple or red marker too close together, as it's entirely possible for 2 crystals to trap the same mob simultaneously, wasting one of the crystals entirely. As Phase 2 begins, the raid and the healers especially should stack up near the bottom of the staircase between the blue and green tank markers, which will force any aggro on the incoming mob to cause them to path right through the tank marker locations, making tank pickups very easy. Once the tanks have their respective mobs, all healers in range should stack up on the first crystal marker at purple. This will cause all resin casts to be immediately dropped off at the gathering location, and therefore not linger on the raid any longer than necessary. Any raid member that becomes fixated by a Windblade should first move forward toward the staircase, and then slightly right or left to either side, away from the pursuant windblade, somewhere in the safe kite areas, until that windblade stops fixating and he or she can move back into position. By staying within these kite areas when necessary, there's never any danger of a windblade crossing over an existing crystal location if it happens to re-aggro on a different tank. Once positions are established, DPS should of course burn down the windblades as normal, keeping the final windblade alive until about 10 seconds or less remain in Phase 2, at which point the windblade can be killed and both Reavers trapped just like normal difficulty. Killing the final windblade with more than 10 seconds left on Phase 2 will cause the phase to end prematurely, regardless of the time that was remaining for the phase. Very similar tactically and positionally to Strategy 1, this method is ideal for raids that have a particular tank that is better suited at a certain role. In this case, Tank A ends up holding 5 windblades, while Tank B has the remaining windblade and both Reavers. This means that Tank A will be taking a huge amount of potential spike damage when all 5 windblades are active, and thus stacking the Band of Valor buff a great deal. The spike damage on this tank can be exceptionally high, so be prepared. Similarly, while Reavers do not deal very much damage in normal attacks, every 15 seconds they will each cast their usual Toxic Slime attack, which deals 150,000 nature damage in a cone, and therefore hits the tank B by itself. However, with 2 stacks of Band of Valor on each Reaver, 2 to 3 mobs in the pack, Toxic Slime will deal 240,000 nature damage before mitigation. Since Reavers tend to cast this near simultaneously, this can be an exceptionally large amount of spike damage that must be dealt with. The time between casts is fairly static, so a small self-mitigation cooldown from the tank can alleviate some of the damage, but the biggest assistance is some form of effective health pool, such as a Shaman heal, adding extra hit points, or Priest absorbs, as well as innate health for the tank themselves. In addition to the high spike damage potential, the other big difficulty with this strategy is performing the actual mob splits as the phase begins. If you do not have a form of threat misdirection, such as our raid unfortunately, then properly getting 5 windblades and 2 Reavers and 1 windblade on each tank respectively can be a real pain in the ass. The method that ended up working best for us was to have both tanks aggro each 4-pack initially, just like Strategy 1, and once in position, the tanks would quickly start taunting out their respective mobs to balance the sides. So in this case, Tank A, that wants all the windblades, would taunt one of the windblades that's on Tank B, and Tank B would also immediately taunt the Reaver from Tank A. And then 8 seconds later, when taunt is up once again, Tank A would grab the last windblade from Tank B, giving us the 5-3 split that we desire. However, while that method works most of the time, that's a long period with mobs moving everywhere and a ton of spike damage on both tanks, so you have to be very, very careful. Finally, we have a strategy that isn't mentioned very often for 10-mans, but is all but the de facto strategy for 25-mans, and for very good reason. 3 tanking for Phase 2 almost entirely eliminates the potential spike or burst deaths on tanks during this phase, and helps dramatically stabilize the damage intake over the entire raid. For that reason, after we tried it, only a handful of times we were able to get the kill, as you see in the video here. So, if you look at the diagram, the setup is very similar to other strategies, except we've added a 5th yellow raid marker directly below our Crystal 1 marker for Tank C. The split of mobs is also quite simple. Both Tank A and Tank B grab each 4-pack as they normally would, but meanwhile, Tank C is taunting out the 2 Reavers as quickly as possible. Once the Reavers are properly aggroed on Tank C, that tank moves back into yellow position, being certain to always face the mobs away from the rest of the raid so that Toxic Slime never hits anyone else. It's also advisable that other raid members should stay on or near the staircase at the start of the phase just for a little while until Tank C is in position to avoid accidental slime hits during the transition. Once in position, due to frequent fixates, this 3-tank setup means that in most cases, any given tank will only be handling 2 or 3 adds at most at any given time. or a maximum of 60% increased damage from Band of Valor, which is quite manageable, and it saves a great deal of potentially required healing. Furthermore, while this image here doesn't illustrate the difference directly, since both Reavers are now far below the raid, the safe area for kiting is actually all of the room to either side or even above the raid if needed. Now, one of the best things about Heroic Grand Empress is that the hard parts occur early on in the fight, and even on Heroic, Phase 3 is actually quite simple to execute with very minimal practice. The first tricky part about Phase 3, however, is properly timing the transition going from Phase 1 into Phase 3 safely. Since Grand Empress starts the transition at 30% health, and the damage in Phase 3 combined with an explosion from a dissonance field carried over from Phase 1 would be quite deadly, the timing is vital. The best method we found was to plan the transition to occur between pair number 1 and pair number 2 of the dissonance fields during Phase 1. However, it's important to keep in mind that field pair number 2 will occur very soon after pair number 1 is gone if it's allowed to run out as normal. That is, if it's drained solely from Cry of Terror. This can cause dissonance field pair number 2 to spawn just as the raid is transitioning into Phase 3, which is a certain wipe. The solution is fairly simple. When preparing to push into Phase 3, halt DPS on the boss around 32 or 33%, and manually force the dissonance fields to explode much sooner than normal by forcing ranged DPS and or healers to step into them for a few seconds and cast a couple spells. This can be performed by applying it to both fields prior to the corrupted dissonance field being selected, as long as energy levels are kept fairly even. Or it can be done on one field at a time, starting with the corrupted first and then the non-corrupted after the corrupted field explosion. If done properly, this can allow the raid 20 or 30 seconds of lag time from the second field explosion before dissonance field pair number 2 actually spawns, in which to push the boss safely into Phase 3. The only other danger is that almost certainly Cry of Terror will be active still in Phase 3. On the first kill, we did not properly plan for this, and it cost us 2 deaths and nearly a wipe, as the Cry of Terror damage is substantial, especially when you combine it with spike damage in Phase 3. Save cooldowns for this transition whenever possible. Now, actually getting through Phase 3 is fairly simple. The first thing to do is establish the raid positions, which should be based on the location of the Heart of Fear energy cloud. So if you look in the top right, that white spark is the Heart of Fear cloud. Essentially, you want to stack the raid, tanks included, with the Heart of Fear cloud on the opposite side of the boss relative to the raid position. This will force the Heart of Fear attack beam to always travel through the boss and therefore hit the tanks, who should be in front of the raid just slightly, prior to hitting anyone else and causing a potential death. When the cone attack of Consuming Terror forces the raid to move out of position, it is worth taking the extra time to move back into position opposite the Heart of Fear, as the DPS requirement is quite lenient in this final phase if the rest of the encounter went according to plan. Additionally, the raid should take care not to stand too near the back of the room where the Empress's cocoon is located, as this area is corrupted and will cause damage over time to any player within it. So you can see it indicated by the black stuff on the ground there. After our first kill, as you see in the video here, we've since learned that it's best to pull the boss slightly down off the staircase before you actually get in positions, and this will eliminate the corruption from accidentally hitting people. Finally, it's worth noting that Visions of Demise on Heroic is exceptionally dangerous and should be dealt with swiftly, as it deals 100,000 damage every tick while it's active. Make sure your healers have a good assignment about how to properly dispel without double coverage. For example, between our Paladin healer and me, our system is that he starts at the end of the raid, and I start at the beginning of the raid until we find the first possible dispel target, so we never cross over. With a third healer for dispel, if one of us gets the debuff as well, that player can dispel one person and we'll still have proper coverage. If there's one thing this encounter is known for, it's the crazy amount of damage dealt to the raid and therefore required healing. A quick search on YouTube or similar reveals that the vast majority of 10-man kills for this encounter resort to utilizing 4 healers, which is quite absurd to not only be viable, but seemingly also encouraged by Blizzard due to the high incoming damage and low DPS requirement. Now, regardless of your strategy for this encounter, the total healing per second that must be sustained throughout the fight is going to be around 250 to 275,000. And without very high DPS, if you get 2 ad phases, early kills of this fight are likely to be near 15 minutes in length. So while high healing per second requirements are not unheard of for fights like Heroic Garrulon, the difference is that Empress is well over twice the length, and that healing per second average includes any short break periods as well as between transitions. Maintaining 350,000 healing per second during dissonance field explosion periods is not uncommon, so get used to the level of damage output, because it's crazy. There are 2 potentially dangerous sections to this encounter that have high spike damage and can cause a wipe or a death. First is Corrupted Dissonance Field Explosion, plus the Corruption Bolts, plus the Cry of Terror ticks during Phase 1. The second is heavy spike damage on the tanks from adds during Phase 2. For everything about Phase 1, there's no need to beat around the bush. Effective health is king. Discipline Priests and Restoration Shamans, albeit perhaps to a lesser degree, are super effective here, as they can essentially increase the potential damage taken for any given raid member by X% by simply adding effective health in the form of extra hit points or extra absorbs. That's not to say your raid will be better off replacing a strong healer with a weak one who happens to be an effective health booster, but if you do have these tools, making proper use of them will dramatically reduce the chance for death during Phase 1. Similarly, Shamans especially are very strong for tank healing in Phase 2, as mentioned before, increasing that effective health pool dramatically, and thus reducing the chance for a full to dead burst of spike damage on a tank. A few healing tips for Phase 1. First, top off the raid just before Dissonance Field explosions. You can have the raid full or nearly full health by monitoring the energy levels of the field very closely. Now, do not be misled by the health of the field. It is the actual energy that dictates when it explodes, and often the field's health will drain faster than the energy. Follow up the sonic discharge explosion with a quick raid-wide heal or 2 if possible, to avoid any spike deaths from random corruption or dread screech damage. 2. Plan ahead who will heal the Cry of Terror target when he or she steps out of the field to get topped off. Number 3. Use a raid cooldown of some sort every single Corrupted Dissonance Field explosion. For example, as a mistweaver, I'm able to get nearly the entire raid covered with Renewing Mists and stock up my chi as a field explosion is about to hit, and this ensures I have a quick series of 2 or 3 raid-wide heals available. We also have a priest using Spirit Shell for every corrupted explosion, and all our raid members use a personal cooldown anytime they can. Some tips for Phase 2 healing. First, make sure you utilize the best strategy for your raid composition. Obviously, it depends greatly on what raid makeup you have, whether you use 2, 3, or 4 healers, 2 or 3 tanks, and you may find Phase 2 healing anywhere from quite manageable to nearly impossible. Now, based on our experience trying everything mentioned thus far in the video, I would strongly recommend a 3-tank, 3-heal strategy if your raid can manage it. As described previously, this method makes Phase 2 much less dangerous, and while spike damage can and still will occur on both tanks and raid members alike, you can easily assign 1 healer per tank and then allow 3 healers to spend time spot healing the raid as well when his or her tank is not in danger. Number 2, rotate cooldowns and stuns. Windblades can and should be stunned anytime they are a threat and are not currently fixated, since they're immune during fixate. This is especially important when using a 5-3 split strategy, where most wind blades are attacking one single target. An AE stun can buy a great deal of time between cooldowns or personal mitigation abilities for the tank, and therefore greatly reduce required healing. Number 3, communicate when healers are fixated. A very common occurrence will be a healer that becomes fixated and must kite a wind blade to one side or the other. This often forces the healer out of range of his or her typical healing target, so make sure healers are vocal about when they are moving and what the other healers should cover in the meantime. And number 4, try to regen mana during the end of Phase 2. This is the only period in the fight where healing will not be as heavy and you'll be down to 1 wind blade and 2 reavers. Try to allow 2 or 3 healers if possible to halt all healing and completely regen during this period. Even 10 or 20 seconds of full regen time can be a massive boost to mana pools, and it's very vital as the fight progresses. And finally, some tips for Phase 3 healing. First, make liberal use of the most efficient heals you have. Since the raid should be entirely stacked up during the phase, this is a great time to make use of the most efficient AE heals available, such as Spinning Crane Kick, Chi Burst, Swift Mend, Wild Mushrooms, Holy Radiance, Healing Rain, etc. Tank healing is secondary, as they do not take a great deal of damage and will be covered by the miscellaneous raid heals for the most part. Number 2, preemptively dispel spam Visions of Demise targets. With the change to dispel mechanics this expansion, you can start spamming dispel a second or so before the actual vision magic debuff is applied without incurring a cooldown. While this will use an extra global cooldown or 2 to do so, if it saves a potential extra damage tick on that player, it will be well worth it. And third, don't be fooled by Calamity. Since Calamity always does 50% of the current health in damage to every raid member, it often seems that the damage is much more severe in this phase than it really is. This isn't to suggest holding off on healing is a good move, since Heart of Fear is still a potential hit on non-tanks if the positions get messed up. But generally speaking, the raid will seem to spike down from 100% to 30 or 50% very quickly, but then rest assured that the same drop won't occur from 30 to 50 down to 0, since Calamity will still only be doing 50% of the current health at the time. So, I think that really covers everything about this fight in as much detail as I can provide. So it's just all about practicing Phase 1 healing and transition, Phase 2 healing, and then once you get into Phase 3, things will come together fairly quickly. So, good luck on Heroic Grand Empress and getting your cutting edge, and thanks for watching.